Countdown to the midterms just 6 months away now, and the American public is increasingly souring on President Trump and his policies. Yet we're not hearing or seeing much pushback from Republicans in Congress. A group of GOP lawmakers anonymously telling MS Now that they can't risk a public break from Trump and are privately, quote, just picking and choosing their battles. Let's bring in MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell and MS Now contributor and senior writer at The Dispatch, David Drucker. Michael, a great report from you on MS.now right now. What more did these lawmakers tell you? Why stick with the president even as his approval rating is tanking?
Yeah, Anna, that's the question that I wanted to explore because, as you mentioned, it's not a great political environment right now for Republicans. And by the way, Republicans will privately acknowledge that. Gas prices are on the rise. The president's approval rating is plummeting. And then Congress's approval rating is at an all-time low. And Congress is right now controlled by Republicans. So all that being said, why are Republicans in Congress sticking with the president, even though they have different qualms with some of his policy positions and decisions and also some of his social media posts? What I learned is it essentially boils down to three main reasons. First off, they don't want to leave Trump because they want to ensure that the base is still energized. Remember, President Trump won't be on the ballot in any of the future elections involving Republicans, but Republican lawmakers want to keep up that enthusiasm that he is so good at sending people to the ballot box. The second is that Republicans feel that they need to vote for Republican values at the end of the day, even if they don't agree with everything the president does and actually think that some of his rhetoric and messaging is not good for the party. They still think that support for him is support for Republican principles. And then the biggest thing I heard was that they're afraid of his wrath. The president is known as going against and having repercussions for members of Congress, Republican members of Congress who go against him. And current Republicans are afraid of that dynamic. I heard from one who said that they didn't want to go to war with the president. Listen to some of these quotes. One person saying the president wields a lot of power and he's not afraid to use it. Maybe other presidents in the past have used some of the power, but it's not been as public as this president has done and is willing to do. Now, in the face of that situation, we're hearing from Republicans that they're picking and choosing what battles they go after in the public, and they're trying to sort of back channel with administration officials behind the scenes to get their qualms answered without having this public confrontation with the president.
David, what's your sense? Is there a threshold where standing by President Trump becomes a political liability and Republicans will have no choice but to jump ship?
Yeah, not in the thick of primary season. And Michael was getting to that with her report there. We are in the thick of Republican primary season, Democratic primary season, too. And it's not just that the president's, willing to go after fellow Republicans in a way past Republican presidents did not. He does not countenance any dissent. Right. So in the past, there'd be a lot of party discipline and enforcement from the White House, for Republican presidents, the same as Democratic presidents. But most White House teams understood that in a situation like this, it was helpful to allow various members of the party to distance themselves from the White House to put them in a better position for the general election. And President Trump will have none of that. You look what happened in Indiana last week, or this week, excuse me, with the state Senate Republican primaries for people that wouldn't approve redistricting in Indiana. And the president continues to wield an enormous amount of power because Republican voters have not abandoned him. So I would expect in the fall we'd see some more distancing, particularly if things haven't improved or that they've gotten worse. But you're just not going to see it for quite a while.
So stand by your man in the primaries, potentially a different story in the general election. I'll note that independents are largely unhappy right now with what they're seeing in this administration. Republican lawmakers, though, are either supporting or keeping quiet on a host of controversial issues. So I find it interesting when Michael talks about their, sense that supporting Trump is support for GOP principles. We don't see them really say much about how he's been tearing down the White House East Wing for his big ballroom, which continues to balloon in costs. He's been attacking the Pope. He's been calling for the DOJ to prosecute his perceived political foes, and the James Comey Seychelles indictment, just the latest example. Michael notes how these actions would have been received very differently if they came from a Democrat. But David, I also wondered, would the GOP reaction be different if this were another Republican president like George W. Bush making these calls?
Well, George W. Bush never made these calls, right? So they didn't have to deal with this. I mean, they had the Iraq War to deal with, but that was a much more conventional time. I mean, this president just does things that no other president has done, and puts members of his own party in a box. But I think after a decade of Trump leading the party, and we are now a decade in, number one, for many, it's just the price of admission. It's the bargain they made, and they look at it as, hey, look, the voters knew who Trump was, warts and all. They reelected him in 2024. So I guess we got to go along for the ride. The other thing here is that after a decade of Trump atop the party, there are so many more Republicans now in Congress that were inspired by Trump, that agree with Trump, and that while they may not act this way themselves, they say, hey, listen, this is politics now, and the voters have given Trump this deference. Now, then you look at the poll and you're like, well, what are you talking about? Independents don't like this. Democrats clearly don't like this. And Republicans are in for a real bruising in November. But when you're talking about the Republican Party, and when their first order of business is keep my job, get renominated, they're simply not going to pick a bunch of fights with the president when they've got to look over their shoulder to keep their job before they can worry about the general election. I think one key thing to watch of all the things you mentioned is that ballroom, right? The White House is now asking for $1 billion of taxpayer funds to build a ballroom that was supposed to cost all of us nothing. And there are a lot of Republicans that are understandably, because there's still they all have common sense. They understand that voters are upset about inflation and the economy. They understand that really isn't too smart politically right now. And let's see if they end up telling the president, we're not sticking that in that reconciliation package now churning its way through Congress. That's simply too tall of an ask for us, even for you.